Klawer, a quiet town along South Africa's west coast, where life moves at a slow, familiar pace. A town well known for its rooibos, its grapes, and its honey. But in February of 2022, a horrifying crime would turn this town upside down. A 13-year-old boy had vanished, last seen running for his life. What happened next sent shockwaves through the nation, exposing the darkest depths of human cruelty. As the truth unfolded, it raised unsettling questions about justice, community, and the hidden dangers that can lurk behind even the most unassuming facades. This is the case of Klawer's most chilling crime, a case that would leave a permanent scar on many within South Africa. This is Jerobejin Van Wyk's story. Hello my Bella Boos and happy 2025. Fine, I know we're in the second month of the year, but it is my first video, so welcome back to Murder Mayhem, a Bella Monsoon exclusive production. Peep the new location. Also, let me know what you think down below. So I hope you all had a blessed festive season. I know it feels like it was years ago, and you've started the year on a good positive note. Honestly, from my end, I know that a lot of you have been patiently waiting for a new video upload, and it has been months. And for that, I do sincerely apologize to every single one of my YouTube Bella Boos. For those of you who don't know, I do actually post almost daily on my other social media pages, especially TikTok. I do understand that not everyone has it though, but if you do, you can consider following me there and checking out the daily content. I've decided it's my 2025 resolution to not leave my loyal fam hanging. But enough of me chattering away. Here's the deal. For those of you who know me, you know the drill. If you're returning, skip ahead to the timestamp on screen. If you're new here, let me break it down for you. So here it is in a nutshell. My name is Bella and I'm a registered mental health professional who just so happens to be obsessed with makeup, true crime, and uncovering the motives that drive people to do what they do. My intimate knowledge and experience within the field thus led me to create the first trauma-informed South African true crime series. That means that on this channel, you can look forward to new videos that look at real-life crimes from a psychological viewpoint. During these episodes, I also try to share psychological knowledge and concepts that you may or may not be aware of in an easy-to-understand format. So if all of that sounds like something that is right up your alley, then please do consider subscribing and joining the Bella Boo family. But if you're more a fan of podcasts, no worries, I got you covered. You can find me for my sister podcast, Murder Mayhem, South African True Crime, available on all major streaming channels. And of course, if you're one of the Patreon Bella Boo VIPs, you get access to all of this with early release and ad-free. So just a quick disclaimer, today's narrative contains material citing the murder and assault of a minor. As always, I mean absolutely no disrespect to the victim nor their family. The purpose of this video is to shed further light on the heinous crime that was committed while spreading awareness about the psychological nature of the narrative. This episode has been thoroughly researched by myself and includes real-life accounts, footage, and images where available from and of individuals involved directly in the case. So without further delay, I know you've been waiting months for it, let's get into it. The location for today's narrative is Klawer. It's a small dorpie, a town, basically known as a quick stop on the N7 for those who are on their way to Namakwaland. A town that went from being virtually unknown to being showcased in the nationwide news as the home to a monster who claimed his victim in a cruel and disturbing manner. Klawer is a town of farms and in turn many farm workers. A town where life is lived at a slower pace and crime is thought to not be as bad as in the big city. But in 2022, for those who believed that narrative, their worldviews were about to come crumbling down. But let me start from the beginning. On the 30th of November 2008, a baby boy was born to Trisha Van Wyk and Jerome Harris. His name was supposed to be Jerobejin, but unfortunately his mother made an error on his documentation, an error that would cost her money to fix, money that she simply did not have. And so his name, a name that will forever be known by so many, would be Jerobejin Van Wyk. He had siblings, but each child was from a different father, as the men would impregnate his mother and shortly thereafter abandon her. She would even later state that one man left her because she would not sleep with him whilst she was pregnant, as she feared that her unborn baby would be hurt. Jerobejin grew up with two older sisters and was a grade 4 student at the Nieuwoudt Primary School. His mother did piecework on local farms in the Olifants River Valley. The work, although incredibly welcome, did not pay well, with her earning only R2.20 for every crate of grapes she would cut and harvest during harvest season. And on top of not being paid a livable wage, her payments were also often delayed. Although they were impoverished, there was no love lost, and Jerobejin lived with his mother and siblings in RDP, governmental housing, in Barry's Hill. Unfortunately, in 2019, his eldest sibling, Adrenal, tragically drowned. This left him with his sister, Jenna Lee, who was 15 years old in 2022. As a young boy, he was always full of laughter and loved playing soccer. Like many other boys his age, he could be naughty, but the truth was, he didn't have a mean bone in his body. He was described as a quiet child by the principal of the school he attended. Unfortunately, though, in the weeks leading up to his murder, his school attendance was poor, a general problem in the town, as many children opted to rather play in the streets than attend class. In the area, it's not uncommon to see young children roaming around without parental supervision, given the fact that many of their parents are employed at farms around the area. There are also no activities for kids to take part in outside of school, so creating trouble and loitering are unfortunately the most common result. Children as young as 9 and 10 are already using drugs, high out of their minds. The neglect and poverty is rampant, along with high levels of alcohol abuse in the community. Many of the adults there use what little money they have, even their SASSA, governmental grants, which are only around 2,000 rand, to buy papsak, an incredibly cheap wine. These behaviors are often rooted in a long history of disturbing acts, namely the DOP system being most widely known. But that is a conversation for another day. It was within the small town rife with systemic challenges that Jerobejin grew up, and so our narrative brings us to February of 2022, the night before the Van Wyk's life would change forever. In an evening like any other, Teresa had returned home from work at around 6:30 p.m. Her daily task involved kneading dough so that the family could have bread to eat, because buying bread was a luxury that they just couldn't afford. The last thing Jerobejin would say to his mother was, "Ma, do you have a sandwich for me?" She didn't though, and unable to fill his belly, he would fall asleep in his aunt's home next door before her bread had even finished baking. The next morning, his mother would drop the sandwiches she made off next door before setting out to the farms for another day of hard labor and little pay. This was the usual routine. But the day that was supposed to be just like any other would end in a far, far different way for so many. On the 2nd of February 2022, 13-year-old Jerobejin awoke early leaving home and immediately meeting up with his friends. They were supposed to be going to school, but they had different plans for the day, namely to dig in trash bins for tins and cans to sell for a few extra bucks. By 8 a.m., the small group of boys were in Tweedala, walking through the residential homes and plots. Keep in your mind the fact that this was a farming community, where many of the neighbors grew their own produce. Right, so the boys are walking along and they saw grapes on a property along the road, and so they picked some. As they ate a few grapes, they then spotted ripe mangoes hanging from a tree just inside the yard of another property. In that moment, they would make a life-changing decision. There was a short wall which they had jumped over, and as each boy grabbed a mango, the owner of the property came running out screaming. Most definitely not wanting to stick around, the boys made a dash over the small wall and down the road. And perhaps they had believed in that moment that that was that. But it was far from over. The man from the property, shirtless and without shoes, fuming with rage, jumped into his vehicle, a bakkie, basically a pickup truck, and started chasing the boys down the street. He had said to them in Afrikaans, which I'll translate, "If I catch you, you'll never see your parents again." And let me tell you now, he intended on honoring that threat. The boys scatter, with two of them running down Matsikama Street, crossing over Berg Street, and then weaving through the cemetery in a desperate bid to lose the man in the vehicle. At the diesel depot on the corner of Church Street and the R362, a more main road, the children ran between two industrial buildings. Jerobejin's friend then jumped into a nearby bin to avoid being caught. However, Jerobejin ran on and turned the corner of the Easy Gas Depot building, disappearing from view. Around that corner, he tried to hide behind a sheet of metal on the porch of another building. He then shouted to his friend to run, and those words would be his last that his friend would ever hear. And as the boy watched helplessly on, he saw a bakkie and the man approaching Jerobejin at speed. He heard a loud thud as the car collided with something just out of his sight, and then silence. In the next moments, the car was driving off again, and Jerobejin was nowhere to be seen. In the days and months that would follow, a full picture of the horrific events of the day would become known to the public. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, as you can imagine, after that traumatic incident, the boy, along with the witnesses of some of the events that transpired, would speak up. This led to Jerobejin's mother confronting the man from the mango tree property. He, however, had stated that although the children were there earlier, they had then run away. He also insinuated that it was most likely that her son had just run away from home. She, however, had said that she knew if her child had indeed run away, he would have run straight to her. As any mother would, she then demanded to know where her son was, but the man said nothing more. According to one of the local residents who had spoken to the man, he had apparently said that where the crows turn, they will find the boy. Super cryptic and kind of odd, right? Well, this was just the beginning of the strangeness. You'll soon hear what I mean. Anyways, so because he had last been seen with Jerobejin by the other boy as well as other individuals, the man was arrested on suspicion of kidnapping on that Thursday. At the Klawer police station, his mother allegedly sat for hours, waiting for an Afrikaans police officer to arrive so that she could be assisted. Keeping in mind that Klawer is a community with predominantly Afrikaans speakers. Later, a service delivery complaint would be lodged against this station. But of course, no wrongdoing was apparently ever found. In the early hours of Thursday morning, around 3 a.m., she left the police station, having made not much progress. After still no sign of the young boy, 2 days later, the police finally searched the man's home, along with his yard. However, not even a trained sniffer dog could find any traces of the child. And perhaps it would have stayed that way if it had not been for a municipal worker who noticed that something was off with the drain on the property. One of them had also seen the owner of the property fiddling with that drain, which was a little bit odd, seeing as it was municipality property. It was then on Friday, the 4th of February, that the disturbing discovery would be made. As items of what looked like meat were removed from the drain, it became apparent that the parts found had been cut into cubes, so unrecognizable that onlookers had initially thought it to be pork, not human. But then a part of an ear was found, which confirmed the horrific reality. Many would later describe the scene as the most gruesome that they had ever witnessed. Jerobejin's mother was at the police station when community members located her to tell her of the discovery. Her heart sunk, as although at that moment there was no DNA confirmation, she knew in her heart, in her soul, that it was her child. She would later state, originally in Afrikaans but translated, "My heart is so broken. I'm exhausted. What's bad is my child didn't even have a chance to eat those mangoes. Wow, I can't believe it." End quote. As the news began to circulate without the DNA confirmation yet, residents of the small town as well as the broader country were horrified at the atrocity that had most likely befallen this young boy, and all over a stolen mango. After the discovery, the man, the owner of the property, and the last one to be seen with Jerobejin, 56-year-old Daniel Smith. He was then set to appear in the Klawer Magistrates Court that following Monday. Forensic experts, meanwhile, continued to comb through the scene for more evidence and any further clues, whilst the identity of the remains was sent for testing to determine if they were in fact the missing boy. Come Monday, many community members gathered to protest in anger at the man who was accused of stealing this young boy's future. Police ended up having to use stun grenades to disperse the crowd. During the standoff, Teresa, his mother, ended up losing consciousness. The initial court session would be incredibly brief, with the charges laid against him including kidnapping, assault with the intent to cause serious injury, murder, and defeating the ends of justice. The state obviously opposed bail, but Daniel didn't even try to apply. His lawyer, Santi Human, however, requested that he be held in a single cell. Her reasoning? Well, apparently it was for the safety of others. And this is where the narrative takes a bizarre turn that never really ends, if I must be honest. She would go on to publicly state to the media that Daniel had confessed that he had murdered the young boy, cutting the child, burning his limbs, and dumping the parts into the drains on his property. She would also state, once again to the media, that this case had nothing to do with racism, but everything to do with the occult, and that Daniel had also killed before. She stated, and I quote, "This case is not about anger or racism. You're not going to find the usual clues at the scene because it was an occult murder." End quote. She would also say that although Daniel was not a Satanist, he had been in the occult for over 20 years, and he had made a deal with the devil.
He was in the occult since the age of 13 for 20 years. He was not a Satanist, although he did make a contract with Satan and the cult group. He says there was 2 contracts he made in blood.
According to her, though, he wanted to be delivered from the evil spirits, and so she had arranged for a spiritual healer in the community to assist. Also, according to her, once again, Jerobejin was Daniel's 4th victim. I'm sorry, what?
Everybody, the people in the health department, everybody needs to come together to heal this community, because if we don't do it here, we will see this happening in other towns, because it will become validated and it will become the norm that someone can just kill a young person because he picked a mango. And that mango, as someone said earlier, that mango was on the land that should not even be in his land. That land should have been the child's land. That mango should have been the child's mango.
The case was then postponed for just over 2 months to April 26th to allow for further investigation, and Daniel Smit, in the meantime, was taken to the Van Reinsdorp prison, where he would be held until his next court appearance. That initial postponement and his lawyer's statement to the press would be a foreshadowing of the bizarre and disturbing information that would come to light as the case unraveled. On the 16th of February, just 2 weeks after Jerobejin went missing, DNA tests confirmed that the remains discovered on Daniel Smit's property were in fact those of Jerobejin Van Wyk. Although providing some form of closure, the confirmation felt like another punch to the gut for his family and friends. Over in lockup, Daniel Smit, whilst awaiting his next court appearance, decided to go on a hunger strike, which resulted in his kidneys starting to fail, and ultimately him being brought to hospital on the 20th of February. After his Vredendal hospital admission and treatment, he would be returned to prison the very same day. A few days later, though, Daniel was back in the news. This time, however, because he wanted to sell his home. You know, the place where the murder took place. And he wanted to donate the proceeds to Jerobejin's mother. Honestly, I'm not even sure what came of all of that. After the DNA results were confirmed, on the 26th of February, Jerobejin was finally laid to rest. The service was paid in full by the community, who just wanted to assist his family. Teresa, who'd been considering cremation, opted for a burial, as she wanted a space she could go to visit when she missed her son. Those who arranged the funeral, though, would not let her look into the coffin, because they knew that seeing what remained of the young boy might have very well been the final nail in her proverbial coffin. Teresa was on the edge, barely hanging on to the threads of sanity that remained. That day, many funeral attendees gathered to pay their respects to the young victim. And although the event marked the closing of one chapter, another chapter was just getting started. As court resumed on the 26th of April, it was heard that Daniel Smit's legal counsel submitted an application to be referred to the Valkenburg Psychiatric Hospital for psychiatric observation. The case was then postponed to the 23rd of May, as there were currently no beds available in Valkenburg. At the end of that court session, Teresa threw a water bottle at Daniel as she yelled in an outburst, and I translate and quote, "You bastard, you killed my child, you should die." Honestly, if you know anything about the justice system in South Africa, you will know that often the bad people, even with evidence, can get away with just a slap on the wrist. And the very thought of that, the thought of justice being stolen from her son too, probably sent her over the edge. Regardless though, the public were then banned from the next court appearance due to safety concerns. In true South African justice and mental health system fashion, as May rolled around, there was still not a single bed available for Daniel's psychological observation. It was claimed that there was a waiting period of up to 30 days for a bed, but as many would soon discover, this time period was grossly underestimated. And come June 21st, yeah, you probably guessed it, it was heard that Daniel Smit was 93rd on the waiting list for people who were referred to the Valkenburg Psychiatric Hospital for observation. He was one of 115 men who were waiting to be admitted. 105 of those 115 had also been charged with serious offenses, so there was no chance of jumping the queue. And so the case was postponed to August 19th, then again to September 13th, and then again, you guessed it, still no beds, still no evaluation, and so it was postponed to November 7th. At that court appearance, it was heard that he was 52nd in line for a bed. And so December 5th, about a month later, was the next proposed date. Whomever did the maths on that, I'll never know. I mean, given that it took about 5 months to move down 40 spaces on the waiting list. But anyway, so whilst the waiting was going on over there, the investigation had of course continued. As I mentioned earlier, Daniel had wanted to sell his vehicle and give the profits to Jerobejin's family, and at that time he had also wanted to sell his property, and that sale had happened. So whilst the case was still ongoing, the new owners had moved in, they had painted, they had fixed up the space, and they were planning on renting it out. It was destined to be rented out to contractors who were doing work in Klawer and needed a place to stay. Before that happened though, around December of 2022, the owner had alerted the authorities to a foul stench coming from an oil drum in the yard. Knowing the history of the house that he had purchased, he had immediately called the police. And would you believe it? There in that oil drum, more human remains were found, about 10 months after Jerobejin's murder. In February of 2023, it was confirmed that the tissue and bones found in the oil drum were indeed those of Jerobejin Van Wyk. I do have questions though, like, why was that property not searched from top to bottom by the police initially? How could the land be sold without all pieces of evidence being gathered? I mean, an oil drum in the yard. Especially after Daniel had admitted to the crime in the very beginning when he was arrested. It honestly makes no sense. And so, a year later, with no sign of justice being served swiftly, Jerobejin's family were left to deal with the new devastating discovery. Our narrative now goes back to the waiting list, I suppose. Look, I'll save you the time and I'll let you know that in August of 2023, 16 months after requesting a psychiatric evaluation, Daniel Smit was finally transferred to Valkenburg Psychiatric Hospital. There, he was set to be evaluated by a panel of psychiatrists and psychologists. During this observation, Daniel also tested positive for tuck, commonly known to many as crystal meth. However, it was believed that he did not purposefully use the drug himself. It was passively ingested, i.e., those around him were using it and he inhaled the fumes. After the observation, according to the report though, he was not classified as mentally disturbed and was therefore not classed as certifiable according to the Mental Health Act. Furthermore, he was able to provide a detailed and sequential analysis of the events that took place that fateful day in 2022. During his observation, he cooperated with staff, did not behave aggressively or disorderly in the wards, and displayed no signs of psychosis or any mood disorders. He would also state that he had actually never killed anyone before, and had left the occult when his son was born, and they had expected him to apparently sacrifice the child. Oh yeah, he has children, but I'm getting there. Point is though, I'm not entirely sure where his lawyer got her version of events from. The final verdict, therefore, according to 2 psychologists and a psychiatrist, was that he was fit to stand a trial. The psychologist who saw Daniel would state in later court hearings that there was actually no evidence to suggest that he had ever been involved in the occult as a teenage boy and young man. It was further reiterated that Daniel showed no remorse for his actions. And so, after 30 days, he appeared again in court at the beginning of September, where it was heard that he was found fit to stand trial, as I mentioned. The case was thus postponed to October. And you guessed it. Come October, once again, the case was postponed, this time to December 14th. It would finally be heard at this session, though, that the trial would take place in the High Court in Cape Town the following year. And so, over 2 years after the murder of Jerobejin Van Wyk, the pre-trial proceedings for his accused killer finally began in March of 2024. Daniel Smith stood accused of charges including attempted murder, kidnapping, murder, mutilation of a corpse, and defeating the ends of justice. The defeating the ends of justice charge related to the way he attempted to mislead police, stating that the boy had been at his house, he had given him food, but then the child had left. The trial was then scheduled for October 14th until the end of November. It was finally during that trial that a full image of the events of that day in February 2022 would come to light to the public, at least. So let's delve in. As we already know, the boys had jumped the wall into Daniel's yard to pick the mangoes from his tree. He had then chased them, ending up cornering Jerobejin by the Easy Gas depot, a short way up the road in the surrounding area. Little did Daniel realize, though, that on the morning as he was recklessly giving chase to the children, a man was observing his behavior and would later prove to be a crucial witness to the events that took place. You see, it had been 10 a.m. that Wednesday when this man had been in his work vehicle on the way to make deliveries. He had then seen a white Ford Bantam buggy, a pickup truck, speeding up. 2 boys were running in front of the vehicle, trying to hide. One had climbed into a garbage bin outside of a building, but the other had tried to hide behind a piece of black metal sheet on the porch of another building. The onlooker then saw the face of the man driving. He looked furious. The onlooker pulled up next to the garbage can, where he told the boy inside to stay put. Whilst that was occurring, the other boy attempted to flee. The manic driver had then turned around the corner and continued to follow him. The onlooker kept his eye on the boy in the bin, as he did not want the man in the buggy to return and knock the bin down. The buggy then disappeared around the corner. A few minutes later, however, it reappeared and drove in the direction of an area known as Klawer. Later CCTV footage would showcase exactly what had happened in those moments to 13-year-old Jerobejin Van Wyk. The onlooker had immediately called the police whilst waiting with the other boy. He had then asked the child if he wanted to drive in his buggy with him. The child had eagerly responded, "Yes, uncle." He then told the child that he must not do these things and he must go to school. Then he too could one day drive a buggy like his. After telephonically informing the police of what happened and waiting for about an hour, police finally arrived on the scene. They were, however, allegedly not too bothered. The witness then physically went to the police station in hopes of better assistance, but there too it appears that he was not helped. The lackluster Klawer police involvement would become a very contentious subject in the conversation and discourse that surrounded this case. CCTV footage from a petrol station, time-stamped at 11 minutes past 10 a.m., would show Daniel speeding in the direction of his home. An employee of the petrol station would remember how he thought the driver of that vehicle was going to damage his car with the way he was driving because one of his tires were already flat. Little did that onlooker know what exactly that vehicle had been used for just minutes prior. But Daniel would appear back in footage later that day, this time with a female sitting in the passenger seat of his vehicle. The footage would be time-stamped at just after 10 minutes past 3 p.m. Within it, Daniel is seen exiting the vehicle, pumping up 2 tires on the right-hand side whilst she remains seated in the car. So who exactly was this mystery woman, you may ask? Well, before the evidence of the trial came to light, many were actually searching for this mystery woman, who had been briefly mentioned by police. Shortly after the police's public appeal regarding this woman, Daniel's lawyer had released a statement stating that she had nothing to do with the events and she had already been spoken to, and it was kind of left at that. It would, however, turn out that it was none other than his own daughter. Yes, I mentioned a son earlier, and now a daughter. daughter. Daniel was actually a man with a family and a daughter who lived in the very same home. Daniel's daughter, Carolina, would also testify that she had actually seen someone in the back of her father's vehicle that day. However, she was unable to allegedly describe the individual. She would also testify that she had seen a brown person in their kitchen, but she was not sure what the pair, her father and this individual, were doing. According to her, later that day, she had felt sick, she had stomach cramps, and she had left the space to go use the bathroom, but before doing so, she had told her father not to hit that brown person. She could not elaborate though when asked as to why she felt that that was the appropriate thing to say to her father in that moment. And that was that. She went back to her study to continue with her work, and she didn't see the boy, that brown person, the next morning. She also stated that Daniel had calmly told her not to be worried on the day that he was arrested. Right, so by now it was pretty evident that Daniel had knocked Jerobejin down and brought him back to his house. But what exactly had transpired from that point? In October, the defense filed a plea explanation with the court. And with this, Daniel's version of events from that very day were heard. In the document, he pled guilty to 4 charges against him, namely murder, kidnapping, mutilation of a corpse, and defeating the ends of justice. He also pled guilty to an alternative charge of negligent driving. According to the statement, he claims that he did not plan to kill the boy. He would state that after chasing the children and driving angrily after him, he did not realize that he'd hit the boy. He did, however, admit to throwing the child in the back of his vehicle. He had then brought the boy, who was still alive at this point, back to his home, where he apparently made him a sandwich and gave him a cool drink. And then, with one swift motion, he broke his neck with both of his hands. That version of events, however, would conflict with the autopsy of Jerobejin's stomach, where no bread was found, only the remains of grapes with purple skins. So ultimately, there was no way of knowing exactly the chain of events that ended up with this boy losing his life. But afterwards, Daniel had stated that he had hid the body in his freezer. He had then taken his daughter to the neighboring town of Vredendal to run some errands, which is where he was caught again on CCTV. Later that night, after she had cooked dinner, he had apparently given her a sleeping tablet. He had then used that time to remove Jerobejin, cut him into pieces, something he had apparently learned in his time with the occult, and burnt those pieces in his fireplace hearth. The body parts that would not burn were thrown into the drains on his property, as well as in the blue bin outside. He would also recount how after the body burnt, he felt lonely and numb. He would also state how he sat on the stoep, the porch, for a long time, knowing that his actions were wrong and punishable by a court of law. He stated how he had thought back to when he had become a reborn Christian in the year 2000 when his son was born. He had left the occult when they had asked him to sacrifice his child. Chillingly, he would later state that although he had chosen back then to not sacrifice his son, he had ultimately offered a son up in the end. On the 28th of October 2024, the verdict was finally in. Daniel Smit was found guilty of the murder of Jerobejin Van Wyk. According to the judge in the case, Judge Haley Slungers, it was clear that from Daniel's actions, he intended to kill the boy when he had kidnapped him that day. In addition to being found guilty of premeditated murder, he was also found guilty of attempted murder, kidnapping, mutilation of a corpse, and defeating the ends of justice. As the verdict was being read, Daniel showed zero emotion. During the sentencing proceedings, a letter from Teresa was read. It had started, and I translate and quote, "I, Teresa Van Wyk, write this letter to the court to reveal my deepest pain, so that everyone present in the court today knows how a mother's heart feels after her child was so cruelly and brutally taken from her." Her letter spoke to how her life had changed irrevocably since Daniel had brutally stolen her son from her, dismembering and mutilating his little body. She questioned why he did what he did and asked him what her son's last words were. She had said, and I quote, "When I close my eyes, I hear my child calling for me, and I see in my mind's eye how my child is being cut into pieces. Tomorrow seems impossible to me. To think I gave birth to a whole body and got pieces back. I will never forgive him." End quote. And Daniel Smith's response to that, you may ask? Well, he asked if he could give the vehicle, the bakkie, that he used to knock the boy down to his parents as penance. He stated that they could use it or sell it. He made this request within his plea for forgiveness in 2 letters, one dated from March of 2024 and the other from just days before the sentencing. Within these letters, he had asked for forgiveness and apologized. His lawyer would state that the boys had taunted him in public, which led to his angry outburst and diminished responsibility. She was then also asked why her client had not divulged that the remains of Jerobejin were in the drum in his yard. She stated, however, that he had just forgotten about it. Yeah, sure. Highly likely. A psychologist, Casper van Zyl, would later testify during the sentencing that Daniel was fully aware at all times of what he was doing when he purposefully chased, kidnapped, and murdered the young boy. Although his counsel pushed the judge for a sentence of 30 years, not a life sentence, ultimately on the 4th of November 2024, Daniel Smith was sentenced to life imprisonment for Jerobejin Van Wyk's murder. The judge stated that the influence of the occult in this case was not established, but even if it was, it would not be a mitigating factor regardless. He was not in danger, provoked, or threatened when he chose to end the life of the young boy. Along with his sentence, Daniel received 15 years for attempted murder, 10 years for kidnapping, 5 years for mutilation of a corpse, and a further 3 years for defeating the ends of justice. Those 33 years will be served concurrently with the life sentence. He will not be eligible for parole until he has served 2/3 of his sentence. His final words had been, and I quote, "I had no right whatsoever to murder Jerobejin Van Wyk. I know and realize that the murder was cruel and heinous. It was wrong. I fully understand the scars of sorrow, pain, longing, and grief that the murder left on the parents, family, community, and friends." End quote. Although the case was finally closed, Teresa would state publicly that she could never forgive him, especially because of the cruel way that he had stolen her son from her. After the media sensation died down, life returned to somewhat normality in the small town of Klawer. Dealing with the aftermath of her son's murder, Teresa has once again become involved with yet another man who physically abuses her, a man who cannot control his anger whilst drunk. And this is life for her. The cycle of violence continues. She uses beer to numb her pain. It's the only thing that takes her brain away, in her own words. She, however, dreams of a better life, and she told a journalist that if she won the lottery tomorrow, she would buy a home overseas and leave Klawer with her daughter. She dreams of a world where a new man in her life will appreciate her, a world where she could be a manager, or perhaps work with her hands. She loves reading and writing, but unfortunately, she was forced to drop out of school in Standard 3. And at the very heart of it, she dreams of her son, Jerobejin, being alive again, being back in her life.
Kom sit ek by my kind en ek sit en huil by my kind. Hy het tyd waar hy man met hom besig is, het hy van my geroep. En dis dit wat my hart so seer maak. Want ek was nie daar om te help nie. En ek sal hom nooit vergewe nie, ek sal hom nooit vergewe nie.
After Jerobejin's death, his sister left school and she became involved with the wrong crowd. His grandmother's health rapidly deteriorated, resulting in her death, and the pain of a lifetime can be seen on the face of Teresa. The consequences of a single man's actions are innumerable, immeasurable, unthinkable. And what about this man, you may ask? Who exactly is Daniel Smith? And how did he end up being the monster who brutally ended the life of an innocent child? Well, it's time for a journey into the mind behind the macabre. Let me introduce you to Daniel Smith. Daniel Smith was born in the 60s. He grew up with both parents and a sister who was 12 years older than him. His family practiced Christianity, and his parents were strict, particularly his father. His father had apparently thrown him out of the house after finding out that he had put a cat into a drum and burned the animal. Following that cruel action, Daniel had then put the cat's bones around his neck. You know, pretty standard stuff, right? Well, maybe for a budding, troubled sociopath, that is. Apparently, as a teenager, Daniel then became involved in the Chinese occult. I say apparently because there's really not much tangible evidence of this besides his own accounts. So there Daniel was, a 13-year-old boy, the same age as Jerobejin, when he was allegedly first introduced to the occult, whilst living in Vredendal. He became well-versed in studying different religions, believing that the occult granted him certain powers. Upon diving deeper into it, he had instantly felt at home. After finishing school, he became an instructor at the infantry school in Oudtshoorn. He wanted to pursue a career there, but his father would not permit it, and so instead he became an assistant train driver. Fast forward to around 6 years later, whilst living in Sea Point in Cape Town, he had apparently been shown by other occult members how to kill an individual without making a mess, without spilling much blood, that is. He was also apparently taught how to burn bodies without leaving any evidence. The remains left over were then thrown out to the sea. When he returned back home to small town Klawer, he still embodied these beliefs. Yahweh, an abbreviation for God's name, was carved into steel, written in an ancient Hebrew alphabet, the Phoenician alphabet, and screwed to the front of his home. It appeared to some, especially those with a knowledge of the Phoenician alphabet, that Daniel considered himself an Israelite. More on that though, just now. So although his life was characterized by physical interactions with people, he still managed to maintain a steady job. He was employed from 1989 at Transnet, where he worked as a train driver. He had moved from one small town to the next, working first in Kathu, then Toosrivier, then Beaufort West, and then, most recently for the 8 years prior to his arrest, he had been stationed in Klawer. At the time of his crime, he was set to retire in just 8 years. Those who knew him, it was a small town after all, remember, described him as being strange, but they never thought that he would be capable of such monstrosities. And isn't this often the case? I cannot count the number of times I've heard in a true crime documentary neighbors stating that someone was odd, but no one thought they would be capable of doing what they did. Anyways, Daniel was known to be a bit unpredictable. One day happy, the next withdrawn and quiet. His colleagues, however, knew of his temper incredibly well. He would throw tantrums and threaten them if he felt aggrieved in any way or form. He'd even told one of them that he was going to kill them, and it wouldn't be the first time that he had taken a life. He also displayed some odd behaviors, like he would wear a black coat even when it was 40 degrees outside, as well as often disappearing with a backpack during lunchtime to the middle of a field.
Mind you, getting away from people to have my lunch, I can totally relate with that.
But I digress. And get this, listen carefully. He also had an obsession with serial killers, watching documentaries and movies and reading books about them. So yeah, I guess I got to keep an eye on all of you. I'm just saying. It apparently wasn't all bad all the time though, as he was known to regularly bake homemade bread for his colleagues. Bread that was quite delicious. Or so I've heard. During these years working as a train driver, he had found a wife. A very young wife, mind you, but I'll explain later. And they had settled down. Their relationship, however, fizzled out, very understandable once I explain more, and after their divorce, he was left to raise their 2 children, a son and a daughter. She had then moved to the south coast of KwaZulu-Natal. At the time of his arrest, his children were 20 and 21 years old, and he had raised them as a single parent for a decade. His son had lived in Clan William at the time, and his daughter, well, she lived with him in the house. Remember? According to her hairstylist, she was a sweet, respectful girl, and it felt like there weren't any strange dynamics in their family, even though Daniel was incredibly protective of his daughter. After the news broke and identities became public, small town things, many were able to locate his son, who worked in a bottle store in the neighboring town. What they didn't know, though, was at the time of the arrest, this young man had immediately visited his childhood home. He had then taken his sister to a place of safety where she would be kept safe and out of the public eye. He had then opted to make himself public enough in the hopes that people would be satisfied finding him and no one would go looking for her. As one can imagine, the sins of a parent cannot be shouldered by their children, who in many cases are innocent. But try to tell that to angry, hurt communities who are seeking justice in any way or form. If there's one thing I know from working with people, often anger and pain can cloud better judgment. That's why I always say, please think before you just share posts on social media. But back to Daniel. Besides his children, he was quite estranged from his family. He had basically written off everyone. His parents had passed away, and his relationship with his sister, remember she was a few years older than him, in particular was strained, as the last time that she had seen him was 2 years prior to his arrest. But wait until I tell you exactly why their relationship was so strained. His sister, Elise Lewis, lives in Hillside in Beaufort West, where she, at the time, was raising a 3-year-old girl whose drug-addicted mother could not look after her. When she had told Daniel this, he had stated that she should give the child back because she's brown.
Yeah, but don't let anyone tell you that him committing murder had anything to do with race, though. Okay?
So, all of that being said, she would still state that she loved her brother and that something must have just snapped that made him act in the way he did. But wait, it gets better. Or worse, actually. According to this very same sister, Daniel had lived together with his wife when he was 30 years old and she was 13. Yes, you heard me correctly. They had later been married and had their son and daughter, as I mentioned earlier. Their marriage, however, was unstable, as Daniel was apparently preoccupied with the occult, and so too was his young wife. According to Daniel's sister, they would cut each other, make blood pacts, and engage in some altogether strange behavior. Allegedly. In case you were curious, no. The mother of his children and his ex-wife opted to not speak to the media. Another family member who remained anonymous would, however, state that they were glad that Daniel's parents were no longer alive. This family member stated that he saw Daniel either in person or spoke to him on the phone at least once a week. Whilst he stated that he could not condone Daniel's actions, he also said that there was a good side to him and that he had never hurt anyone before. Look, I'm pretty sure many of you would not be surprised to learn that family blinkers are a real thing. This family friend who remained anonymous went on to state that the police in the area were quite useless and that crime had really gotten out of hand. Allegedly, pipes were stolen from Daniel's property and the police did nothing about it. This man would then follow this piece of information by stating that basically frustrations built up after Daniel experienced injustice. To me, it sounds like this man was trying to give him some form of excuse or justification for his actions, but that's just my opinion. I'm just saying. The man would lastly state that he had no idea that Daniel was involved in the occult at any point in time. But it wasn't just him who didn't find any trace of the occult though. As the investigation had proceeded after the initial discovery of the body parts, the police forensic team did not find any signs of the occult. This drastically opposed the narrative that both Daniel and his lawyer had earlier shared. Honestly, I was incredibly surprised by the way in which Daniel's lawyer, Santi Human, handled his entire case. From spreading what I would have deemed at the time of an ongoing case, mind you, as intimate knowledge, confessions, to the media, to running amok with the occult aspect. It's a very satanic panic of the 80s, 90s-esque. You know where all the bad stuff that happened at that time was due to Satanists and heavy metal? Look, the thing is, although Satanism might have an extremely bad rep due to the way it has been portrayed in the media, the principles of this alternative religion don't align with murder. I'm not an expert on the topic, but if you're interested, there's a lot of literature and content around it out there, and I did speak about it in depth in one of my previous episodes. What was found in Daniel's home, however, was a cat carcass wrapped in a black bag. Within a locked black box, 2 rolled up bin bags were found. Within those 2 bags, 2 small skulls were located. It was believed that they were animal skulls, but nevertheless, away they were sent for forensic analysis. A bunch of knives and Bibles, as well as boxes of hard liquor and survival kits were also found. Apparently, in every single room, there were knives, combat knives, machetes, many engraved and clearly also valuable. Altogether, between 40 and 50 knives would be found in the home. That's an insane collection. Along with that collection, many Bibles and writings were discovered, which soon linked Daniel to his involvement with the Israelites, a religious group that apparently believes the end of the world is near. This makes sense given all the weapons and survival kits. Each survival kit, one was found in every room, contained a water tank, pliers, wire, and a knife. Think doomsday preppers. And And if the world was ending, it's evident that Daniel was sure as hell not going to be sober for it. Around 140 boxes of whiskey and vodka were found in his garage, along with 20-liter cans filled with soybeans and rice. There were also gas stoves and paraffin in the same space. Daniel was meticulously keeping notes and writing things down, even keeping newspaper clippings of the drowning of his younger brother, Davy Smith, who was 20 years old in the 1990s. Davy had been a police officer. Daniel had also kept his wedding video and letters from his mother, along with photographs of himself and his children when they were toddlers, amongst others. So it appeared by all means that Daniel was quite a present, fully cognizant man who was particular with his space. The forensic team would oddly also fail to find any remains of the young boy in the hearth, his fireplace where he allegedly burnt the body. Although there were blood splatters in the house, namely in the briar room, lounge, kitchen, his bedroom and the ensuite bathroom, amongst other places, the ashes tested in the fireplace were not a human match. Based on the blood and the congealed nature of the fluid found in his bedroom, investigators were led to believe that his room was the main location where the dismemberment had occurred. During an evaluative psychologist report, it was Casper Van Zyle's opinion that Daniel's ability to relate to people was restricted. According to him, Daniel was a loner and often suspicious of the motives of other people. His belief was that there were many manifestations of psychopathy, like lack of feelings, no real remorse, self-justification of actions and lies, dissociation of major events, manipulation, cruelty, etc., all within Daniel's life narrative. His most distinctive life event, however, would end up being the brutal murder of a young boy. A boy who was killed for a mango that he never even had the chance to eat. And one of the saddest parts of this story is that Jerobejin may be a boy whose story is known to the public, but there are so many others who remain just statistics. The town of Klawer itself is no stranger to children going missing. A young girl, 8-year-old Geneva Deergal, who had cerebral palsy, disappeared from outside her home in 2019, and to this day has not been found. She was a shy child who didn't talk much and didn't trust strangers, so a search was immediately launched. Unfortunately, nothing ever came of it. I mean, even whilst this case was ongoing, in August of 2022, another farmer, 58-year-old Frans Nieuwert from Klawer, was arrested after he allegedly assaulted a 14-year-old girl because she stole vegetables. When she was caught, she did not run, but instead was hit with an open hand and a clenched fist. At that point in time, the man's wife had also threatened to set their dogs on the girl. So yeah, clearly some things are evidently just never going to change. And that's a damn pity, because many in the community are stuck in a cycle of poverty, violence, and substance abuse. They live in a space where those who are supposed to serve and protect are just not present. After this case made the news, the SA Provincial Police Chief stated that there were serious staff shortages in Klawer and that the vacancies would be aimed to be filled moving forward. This case also highlighted that the state of affairs in government and mental health is in a dire space. Valkenburg Hospital is the only psychiatric hospital in the entire Western Cape province, mandated by law to do forensic assessments and admit state patients. It only has 391 beds for every single patient though. And even though there's been a massive increase in the past years in admissions, funding has remained tight, with excess funds non-existent. As we approach the end of this narrative, you may be wondering why this entire episode you've only seen 2 images of Jerobejin. The answer is simple enough. There just aren't any others. Mourning the loss of a life taken too soon, Teresa didn't even have one picture of her son. Everything she had ever had of him was on her phone, a phone that had recently been stolen by local thugs. The school that he attended was able to grab a screenshot from a video that he had taken part in, and that, along with a single image from an earlier year, was and is all tangible that remains of this young boy's life. My investigation into the Klawer tragedy draws to a close, and honestly, we're left with more than just the details of a harrowing crime. We're faced with the stark realities of a community struggle for justice and healing. The brutal loss of young Jerobejin Van Wyk has exposed not only the depths of one man's cruelty, but also the systemic neglect that can allow and enable such horrors to unfold. Yet, amid the sorrow, there emerges a quiet call for accountability, unity, and the courage to demand change. In Klawer, the scars of that fateful day continue to remind us that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit endures. This case is a testament to the power of community resilience, a call to stand together in the face of injustice and work tirelessly for a future where every life is valued and every single voice is heard. Thank you for joining me and being a part of this journey. May the memories of those lost inspire us all to seek truth, compassion, and a better tomorrow. May Jerobejin never be just a forgotten soul. You have heard his story and you know his name. He will not be just another statistic. He had a life and it mattered. He did not deserve the end he received. Rest easy, sweet soul. So until the next one, stay safe, stay blessed, and stay the amazing human beings that I know each and every single one of you are. Bye!